Hello everyone, this is Mike History and welcome to another video. So this video is directly related to my video on the Rothschilds, which I believe should be my last video, although because I'm recording this in advance, I don't know exactly what my uploads ended up looking like. But I would like you guys to watch that video first. It's not necessary for the context for this video, but it does help a lot. Alright, so let me explain. While I was researching my video for the Rothschilds, I actually ended up going down an interesting rabbit hole. Because while the origins of the Rothschild family is Jewish, two of them actually married into prominent British families, and so while doing my research on the origins of the Rothschilds, I actually spent about 95% of the time researching the families of these British ancestors, which had nothing really to do with the original family. So one example of this is Hannah Primrose, the Countess of Rosebery, who married Archibald Primrose, the 5th Earl of Rosebery, a man who later became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Now he was fully English, so there's nothing particularly interesting about him. However, their son, Neil Primrose, married Victoria Stanley, the daughter of Edward Stanley, the 17th Earl of Derby. His father, Frederick Stanley, 16th Earl of Derby, was Colonial Secretary and later Governor-General of Canada, and he created the Stanley Cup, which is the championship trophy for ice hockey. Frederick's father was Edward Smith Stanley, 14th Earl of Derby, who was actually Prime Minister 3 times. Now he was still overwhelmingly English in ancestry with a bit of Scottish and Irish as well. His grandfather, Edward Smith Stanley, 12th Earl of Derby, was fully English, but his wife, Elizabeth Smith Stanley, Countess of Derby, was much more Scottish, with significant English, Irish, and most notably a bit of French and German ancestry too. She came from the Hamilton family and was the great-great-granddaughter of William Hamilton, Duke of Hamilton. His father, William Douglas, 1st Marquess of Douglas, was fully Scottish, but his mother was the daughter of George Gordon, 1st Marquess of Huntly, the 7 times great-grandson of Alain de Winton, a French soldier from Scotland. George Gordon's mother, meanwhile, Anne Hamilton, Countess of Huntly, was the great-great-great-granddaughter of John Hamilton of Cadzow, who was another Norman soldier from Scotland. Now, if we get back to the paternal side here, George Gordon, 1st Marquess of Huntly, was the son of George Gordon, 5th Earl of Huntly, whose mother, Elizabeth Keith, Countess of Huntly, was the granddaughter of John Douglas, the 2nd Earl of Morton. He himself was the grandson of James I of Scotland, through his daughter, Joan Stuart, Countess of Morton. As you can imagine, for a Scottish king, James I was mostly Scottish, but his wife, Joan Beaufort, Queen of Scots, was 2/3 French. However, unlike what you might think, she did not come from France, but was born in the Palace of Westminster. This is because her father, John Beaufort, the 1st Earl of Somerset, was the grandson of Edward III of England. Despite Edward famously starting the 100 Years' War against France, he was actually 72% French due to his mother, Isabella of France, being the daughter of Philip IV of France, which is why he had the claim on the French throne in the first place. Isabella's husband, Edward II of England, was even more French than she was, being 4/5 French. His father, Edward I, grandfather Henry III, and great-grandfather John were all over 4/5 French, and John's father was Henry II, the famous founder of the Angevin Empire, whose name derives from the county of Anjou, which he ruled over before taking over England in 1154. However, even before taking over Anjou, he became Duke of Normandy in 1150, which he had inherited from his father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. Geoffrey was married to Empress Matilda, who claimed the throne of England from 1141 to 1148 during the Anarchy. She was the daughter of Henry I of England, who was the son of William the Conqueror, who was nearly totally French, and his wife Matilda of Flanders, who was half French, mainly through her mother Adela of France, who was the daughter of Robert II of France, who was the son of Hugh Capet, often considered the first king of France, as we know it, and the founder of the Capetian dynasty in 987. Alright, so why did I just make you learn all that useless trivia? Well, the reason why is because it shows how French the British upper class used to be. And I say British, not English, because unlike what you might believe, the Normans did not only become the upper class in England, but as we see in this example, also became the upper class in Scotland as well. And while this is only the example of one family that I researched into, we see many similar stories that include other English, Scottish, and even Irish nobility. So what am I getting at here? Well, through rabbit holes like the one I just showed you, I came to realize that the English upper class had once been almost totally French. But today that isn't the case. So this video will delve into how the English rulers stopped being French. Now, when William the Conqueror invaded, he subjugated England. And when I say subjugated, I really mean that. While history books often finish his story on the 14th of October, 1066, after the Battle of Hastings, in reality he wasn't able to consolidate his rule over such a large country so easily. Many Anglo-Saxons in the north resisted Norman rule, which led to William's harrying of the north in 1069 and 1070, during which he devastated the land and might have caused a population decline of nearly 3/4 of the population. Similarly devastated was the local English upper class, which was replaced almost completely by Normans and other Frenchmen. Now, I should stop now to clarify that although the Normans did have a unique culture, they were definitely French, speaking Old Norman, which was a dialect of Old French. The Old Norman that was spoken in England came to be known as Anglo-Norman, though this is not a different language, instead just being a dialect of French. However, Anglo-Norman was not just any dialect, but was the embodiment of Anglo-Norman culture, which remained the culture of the elites throughout the 12th and 13th centuries in England. This was maintained due to constant marriages among the Anglo-Norman elite, or alternatively, marriages to French elites across the Channel. This separation from the English people they ruled over allowed the Anglo-Normans to maintain not just a cultural and linguistic distinction, but also a genetic distinction. Now, obviously, some of them did marry locals, but this was quite rare. Nevertheless, one of the English marriages to the French would result in the unraveling of the relationship between the two countries. Now, as I already mentioned earlier, the 100 Years' War broke out as a result of Edward II of England's marriage to the daughter of Philip IV of France, Isabella. This made his son, Edward III, the closest male heir to the French throne. This was because Philip IV's son and heir, Charles IV of France, had died without any sons. However, despite the culture of the French and English elites being nearly identical, the French nobility still were not comfortable with the English domination of their country, and so chose the dead Charles's cousin to become Philip VI of France. And this triggered the 100 Years' War, which was neither a war nor lasted for 100 years. Instead, it was a series of 3 wars that were fought in separate periods during a time of 116 years. The first war from 1337 to 1360 went relatively well for the English, even resulting in the capture of John II of France at the decisive Battle of Poitiers in 1356. However, the second war from 1369 to 1389 went much less well, and it's around this time that we start seeing a shift in the English upper class. Not only fighting against, but losing to the French for decades made many Englishmen of all classes to start to hate the French, and this feeling started to extend to the rulers as well. As such, the shift away from French culture began to be seen in the English upper class. This process was gradual, of course, but I would argue that a good representation of the shift in an individual is the story of Henry V, who embodied this change quite well. He was born in 1386, not long before the end of the Second War. His father, Henry IV, ascended the throne in 1399, and notably was the first king since William the Conqueror to take his oath in English. This influenced young Henry, who became the first king to also write in English after his father's death in 1413. Now, of course, Henry V is most well known as a warrior king who won the decisive Battle of Agincourt 2 years later, and nearly subjugated France before his untimely death in 1422. If this event had not happened, history could have turned out very differently. Charles VI had disinherited his own son and had made Henry his heir. Charles died in 1422, but Henry died 2 months earlier, and his successor, Henry VI, was just 8 months old. This meant that he was in no position to secure France from Charles VI's disinherited son, Charles VII, who retook France thanks to England's weak position and a certain peasant girl. Now, if this had not happened, Henry V might have actually inherited France and re-established the link between the two states, and the English elite, which was still relatively French at the time, might have assimilated back into the culture of their French ancestors. However, this was not to be. Not only did the English get kicked out of France for good, but Henry V's war with France, which aimed to unite the countries, actually achieved the opposite, and was the final push needed to establish a separate identity for the English. After the 100 Years' War conclusion in 1453, nobody in England wanted to be associated with the French, and by then not only the upper class but also the Parliament was being conducted in English. It was also during this time that marriages between the English and French upper classes mostly ceased, and soon the English upper class began marrying local English women. By now, most of the English upper class was not just no longer culturally or linguistically French, but increasingly they were becoming less ethnically French too. The finalization of this process came after the end of the Wars of the Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York, 2 branches of the Plantagenet dynasty which were ruling England. By its end in 1487, the male line of the Lancasters was extinguished and both houses were united by marriage, leading to the creation of the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII. not only was Henry more English than French, but he was also a quarter Welsh through his grandfather Owen Tudor. This meant that for the first time in centuries, the English ruler was more ethnically British than French, and this basically marked the end of the Anglo-Norman culture. Now, this was not a very long video, but I thought it was an interesting side project that I started to work on while doing research for the Rothschilds. So if you found this video on the history and the ancestry of the Anglo-Normans interesting, well then don't forget to like this video. A lot of the research I did was also based on a much longer previous project I did on the ancestry of Elizabeth II, so I'd also recommend you to check that out as well. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.